The road was empty. That's the thing nobody talks about first. Not the bodies. Not the gun. The road. It was just a road outside Vallejo, California, and it was empty, and two teenagers had no reason to believe the night would end any other way. December 20th, 1968. Betty Lou Jensen was 16 years old. David Faraday was 17. They had pulled off onto Lake Herman Road the way teenagers do, the way they had probably done before. The engine idled. The windows fogged. And then someone walked out of the dark. If you're new here, welcome. If you've been here before, welcome back. This channel tells stories that stay with you. Stories that matter. Stories that hit home. Drop in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if this is the kind of storytelling you come back for, it means a lot when you subscribe. It's the simplest way to keep this going. Now, back to that road. David was shot first. The bullet struck him near the left ear while he was still seated in the car. He never made it out. Betty Lou ran. She made it 28 feet. Investigators measured it later, before she was shot 5 times in the back. She was found lying in the gravel, face down, still in her dress. A passing motorist discovered them minutes later and called it in. When officers arrived, David was still breathing. He died before the ambulance reached the hospital. There was no robbery, nothing taken, no connection between the victims and any known suspect. No one saw a face. The only thing left behind was brass, and a silence that didn't fit any pattern investigators recognized. Vallejo was a Navy town, working class, post-war, the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and assumed the worst happened somewhere else. The Jensen-Faraday murders landed in the Vallejo Police Department's lap and stayed there, unanswered, for months. Detectives had no murder weapon, no witnesses who could place anyone at the scene, and no motive they could build a case around. Random violence was the working theory. A drifter, maybe, someone passing through. The case grew cold the way cold cases do. Not all at once, but gradually as other crimes demanded attention and resources shifted. Betty Lou's parents buried their daughter in January. David's family did the same. By spring, the road had gone quiet again. 6 months passed. On July 4th, 1969, a man opened fire on a couple parked near Blue Rock Springs Park. Also in Vallejo, barely 4 miles from the first scene. Darlene Farron, 22 years old, died from her wounds. Michael Mageau, 19, was shot multiple times but survived. He would later describe the attacker. A heavy-set white male, medium height, who approached the car without urgency, fired, walked back to his vehicle, then returned and fired again when Mageau cried out. He wanted to be sure. He then drove away at a normal speed. 40 minutes after the shooting, a man called the Vallejo Police Department from a payphone on Tuolumne Street. The call was brief. He reported both attacks, the one that had just happened, and the one on Lake Herman Road 7 months earlier. Then he hung up. The man who made that call was not afraid of being traced. He was not rushing. Investigators who reviewed the call noted what wasn't there. No panic, no distortion in his voice, no background noise that could place him. He spoke as though he were reporting a traffic incident. Michael Mageau's survival was not something the caller addressed. It was either an oversight or it didn't matter to him. Either answer is disturbing in a different way. The Vallejo PD now had a living witness, a dead victim, a prior unsolved double homicide with the same geographic signature, and a killer who had just announced himself by telephone. The question that would define the next 5 decades was already forming. Who was this man? And why did he want them to know he existed? August 1st, 1969. 3 newspapers received letters on the same morning. The San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, the Vallejo Times-Herald. Each letter was handwritten. Each contained identical details of both crime scenes, details that had never been released to the public. This was not a crank. Each letter also contained 1/3 of a 408-symbol cipher. The writer demanded the newspapers print the cipher on their front pages. If they refused, he wrote, he would go on a killing spree, and he described what that would look like in terms that left no room for ambiguity. He did not sign his name. He signed a symbol, a circle with a crosshair through it. A scope, target, something he had designed himself. The newspapers published the cipher. The Chronicle's editor made the call after consulting with police. The public reaction was immediate. People called in tips. Cryptographers wrote in. Amateur codebreakers mailed their attempts. None of them broke it in time. But on August 8th, 1 week after publication, a schoolteacher named Donald Hardin and his wife Betty, working at their kitchen table in Salinas, submitted a solution. They had made 2 assumptions that turned out to be correct: that the killer's ego would lead him to use the word I early, and that a man who killed for pleasure would use the word kill. Those 2 anchor points unlocked the frequency pattern. Within hours, they had broken it. What the Z408 said when it was decoded was not a name. It was not a location. It was a statement about who he believed he was. The message described killing as a form of collection, that the people he murdered would become his slaves in the afterlife, that he would not give his name because it would slow down or stop the collection. He wasn't confessing. He was explaining his logic. He wrote it down and mailed it to strangers because he wanted someone to understand how his mind worked. That distinction between a killer who hides and a killer who explains was something behavioral analysts had rarely encountered at that scale. It would shape criminal psychology research for decades. On September 27, 1969, a man attacked Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard at Lake Berryessa in Napa County. He arrived wearing a black hood with the crosshair symbol stitched onto the chest. He bound them with pre-cut lengths of rope he had brought with him. He stabbed Hartnell 4 times. He stabbed Shepard 10 times. Then he walked to Hartnell's car and wrote the dates of all 3 attacks on the car door in black ink, including that day's date. Hartnell survived. Shepard died 2 days later. He was organized. He was theatrical. He planned in advance and he documented his own crimes on the scene. And he was still unknown. 2 weeks after Lake Berryessa, he killed again. This time in the middle of a city. San Francisco, October 11, 1969. A cab driver named Paul Stein picked up a fare at the intersection of Mason and Geary. The destination was the Presidio Heights neighborhood. Stein never got there. At Washington and Cherry Streets, the passenger shot him once in the head at close range. Then he did something that should have ended everything. He stayed at the scene. He tore a piece of Stein's shirt from his body. He wiped down the cab with it. 2 teenagers watching from a window across the street saw a white male leaning into the cab, moving deliberately, unhurried. They called the police. Officers arrived within minutes. They passed a man matching the description on foot and did not stop him. The dispatcher had transmitted the suspect description incorrectly, male Negro instead of male white. He walked away because of a typo. 3 days later, the Chronicle received another letter. This time it included something that hadn't been in any of the previous ones. A piece of Paul Stein's shirt, blood-stained, torn at the edge. He had taken it as proof. He had held onto it for 3 days, then mailed it with the casual confidence of a man who did not believe he would ever be caught. The letter also contained criticism. He was angry that police had come close and failed. He mocked them directly. He told them how he had evaded them that night, describing the moments after the shooting with a clarity that made clear he had enjoyed the near miss. It wasn't a taunt born of fear. It was a taunt born of certainty. The letter that arrived on November 9th was different. It was addressed to F. Lee Bailey's defense attorney Melvin Belly, and it sounded different from all the previous ones. The arrogance was still there, but underneath it was something closer to desperation. He said he had headaches. He said he was losing control. He asked Belly to help him. Criminologists who later studied the correspondence flagged this letter as a potential turning point, a moment where the psychological architecture shifted. Whether it was genuine distress or performance, no one could determine with certainty. But the headaches claim would surface again and again in subsequent letters, like a recurring detail the writer couldn't let go of. Something was changing inside whoever was writing these. By the end of 1969, the Zodiac, the name he had given himself in that first August letter, had claimed 5 confirmed victims, 2 survivors, multiple ciphers, dozens of letters, and 0 arrests. The San Francisco Police Department, the Vallejo PD, and the Napa County Sheriff's Office were all working the case with no formal coordination structure. Each department had its own files, its own suspects, its own theories. Information that should have connected didn't connect because there was no single place for it to land. This was not incompetence. This was 1969. No centralized database. No behavioral analysis unit. No DNA testing. The investigators working this case were doing it with index cards, telephone calls, and instinct. And he knew it. 1970 brought more letters, no more confirmed killings. He wrote about bombs. He included diagrams, detailed, functional-looking schematics for devices he claimed to have planted along school bus routes. The letters were specific enough that law enforcement had to treat them as credible threats. Bus routes were monitored. Patrols increased. Nothing detonated. Whether the bombs ever existed was never confirmed. But the effect was achieved regardless. Resources were redirected, fear spread into new spaces, and the city understood that his reach was no longer limited to parked cars and isolated roads. He was scaling up the psychological pressure without necessarily scaling up the violence. That pattern, threatening more than he delivered, would define the later years of his correspondence. The letter count climbed through 1970 and into 1971. He claimed his victim count was higher than what police had confirmed, reaching as high as 37 in some letters. Investigators could not verify these numbers. Some researchers believed the inflation was psychological, a man padding his legacy, unwilling to be measured by 5 when he wanted to be measured by dozens. Others believe some of the additional murders may be real, scattered across Northern California in cases that were never connected. The confirmed number stayed at 5. But the unconfirmed shadow of the case grew longer every year. And that shadow fell over families who had no answers and no way to know if the thing that had taken someone they loved had a name they would ever hear spoken in a courtroom. His last confirmed letter arrived in 1974. It referenced a film, The Exorcist, which he reviewed with casual detachment, as though cultural commentary was a natural extension of his correspondence with law enforcement. Then he stopped. No more letters. No more ciphers. No more proof-of-life shirt fragments or bomb diagrams or taunts addressed to detectives by name. Just silence. The silence that follows that kind of noise is its own kind of weight. For investigators still working the case, the absence of contact was not relief. It was a new set of questions with no frame to put them in. Did he stop killing? Was he incarcerated for something unrelated? Was he dead? Or had he simply decided the game was over on his terms? The years after 1974 produced hundreds of suspects. Some were named publicly. Some were investigated quietly and cleared. Some died before the case could catch up to them. One name rose above the rest and stayed there for decades. Arthur Lee Allen. A schoolteacher and convicted sex offender from Vallejo, Allen was first seriously investigated in 1971 after a former friend reported a disturbing conversation they had shared before the killings began. Allen had allegedly discussed hunting humans. He owned a Zodiac brand watch with the crosshair logo. He wore the same type of shoe as impressions found at one of the crime scenes. His timeline placed him in proximity to multiple attacks. He was investigated 3 times. He was never charged. When DNA testing became viable, investigators applied it to the envelopes and stamps the killer had licked. The profile they extracted did not match Arthur Lee Allen. Allen died in 1992 at his home in Vallejo of kidney failure. He was never arrested. He was never exonerated. His case sits in the permanent gray zone that defines much of this investigation. A man the evidence pointed toward, circled, and then retreated from, leaving nothing conclusive in either direction. Whether Allen was the Zodiac is a question the evidence cannot answer. What the evidence can answer is this: whoever he was careful. He was patient. He understood how investigations worked. And he knew exactly how much he could leave behind without leaving enough. There is a number that sits at the center of this case like a stone that won't move. 340. That's how many symbols the second cipher contained. The Z340 arrived at the San Francisco Chronicle on November 8, 1969, 3 weeks after Paul Stein's murder. It was accompanied by a letter that mocked police and included another piece of Stein's shirt. The cipher itself was denser than the first, more deliberate. The symbols were arranged in a 17 by 20 grid. At first glance, it looked similar to the Z408, a substitution cipher, the kind where each symbol represents a letter. That assumption was the trap. Every expert who approached it that way walked directly into the wall he had built for them. And for 51 years, not one of them found the door. The first serious attempt to crack the Z340 came within weeks of publication. The Naval Intelligence Command assigned cryptanalysts to it. The NSA reviewed it, a fact confirmed through declassified records decades later. Professional codebreakers who had worked on wartime communications, men and women who had spent careers breaking Soviet encryption, looked at this cipher produced by an unknown individual in Northern California and could not break it. The early consensus was that the cipher was solvable. It had enough symbols to contain enough pattern, but that something about its construction was deliberately irregular. There were inconsistencies in the symbol usage that didn't map cleanly to any standard cipher type. It was built to look like one thing and be another. He had engineered confusion into the foundation. Decades passed. The Z340 became the most analyzed unsolved cipher in American criminal history. Universities included it in cryptography curricula. Hobbyists built databases around it. A community of amateur and professional codebreakers formed online, sharing attempts, peer-reviewing theories, and developing software tools that hadn't existed in 1969. None of it was enough. Every few years, someone would claim a breakthrough. The claim would circulate. Researchers would test it. It would collapse. The cipher held. What made it different from the Z408 wasn't just the complexity of the encoding, it was the layers. The Z340 didn't just encrypt a message. It encrypted the method needed to find the message. Breaking it required first understanding how it was built. An understanding that required a way of seeing it that no one had found yet. David Oranchak had been studying the Z340 since 2006. He was a software developer based in Virginia, not a professional cryptographer. He had no formal background in code breaking. What he had was focus, the specific kind that comes from caring about a problem more than you care about being the person who solves it. He built a website dedicated to tracking Z340 research. He documented every attempt. He cataloged every failure. He maintained correspondence with researchers across multiple countries, aggregating knowledge that was scattered across forums and academic papers and personal email threads. For 14 years, he got nowhere. But the nowhere was organized. And organized nowhere, in code breaking, is the foundation everything else gets built on. Jarl van Eyck was a Belgian programmer with a deep background in cryptanalysis software. He had developed AceDecrypt, a tool specifically designed to attack complex substitution ciphers using computational brute force combined with language frequency optimization. The software could test millions of symbol-to-letter mapping combinations per second, scoring each result against the statistical patterns of the English language. It was the most sophisticated tool ever applied to the Z340. Van Eyck joined Oranchak's effort and began running the cipher through AceDecrypt in every configuration that had been theorized. Standard substitution, columnar transposition, reversed reading directions, diagonal reads. None of them produced readable English. The cipher rejected every approach cleanly, which meant the approach itself was still wrong. The third member of the team was Sam Blake, an Australian mathematician and data scientist. Blake's contribution was not in cryptanalysis directly. It was in visualization. He built tools that could render the Z340 grid in three-dimensional space, allowing the team to see symbol patterns not as flat rows but as structures that could be rotated, layered, and examined from angles that a flat page couldn't offer. When the grid was visualized this way, something emerged. Not a solution, not yet, but a structural irregularity that hadn't been visible before. A pattern in how certain symbols were distributed across the grid that didn't fit a standard substitution model. To fit something more complex, something that used the grid itself as part of the encoding mechanism. Blake flagged it. Oranchak and Van Eyck turned toward it, and the door began to appear in the wall. What they found was this. The Z340 was not a standard substitution cipher. It was a transposition cipher layered over a substitution cipher, meaning the symbols had to be rearranged before they could be decoded. The rearrangement wasn't random. It followed a specific diagonal reading pattern. Symbols pulled from the grid, not left to right, not top to bottom, but at angles, skipping rows in a sequence the writer had embedded in the construction. The grid had to be read in the right direction before any frequency analysis could work. Every previous attempt had been frequency analysis applied to the wrong arrangement. The cipher hadn't been hiding a message. It had been hiding the instructions for finding the message inside the structure of the message itself. He had folded the key into the lock. The breakthrough came in late November 2020. Oranchak was running a new transposition variant through AceDecrypt, one that incorporated the diagonal reading pattern Blake had identified, when the software began returning output that wasn't noise. Fragments of English, not perfect, not clean, but recognizable words in sequence. He posted in the team's private communication channel. Blake and Van Eyck responded within minutes. They spent the next several days refining the transposition key, adjusting the diagonal parameters until the English resolved from fragments into sentences. When the full message assembled, they sat with it for a moment before anyone said anything. Not because it was shocking, because it wasn't. After 51 years, the message was exactly what you'd expect from a man like this. And somehow that made it worse. Before we get to what that message said, take 60 seconds and subscribe if you haven't. Every subscriber keeps this channel alive and keeps these stories getting told. Hit subscribe. We're going right back in. The decoded Z340 read, in part, as a statement of continued intent. He referenced enjoying the hunt. He commented on the police investigation, dismissively, as though watching amateurs attempt a professional's work. He used a linguistic construction that researchers had flagged in earlier letters, a specific way of describing his victims that stripped them of individuality while simultaneously centralizing himself. There was no name, no location, no confession in any legal sense. But there was a voice, the same voice that had been writing letters since 1969, now audible again after 5 decades of silence. The Z340 had spoken. It just hadn't said what anyone needed it to say. The FBI confirmed the solution on December 11, 2020, 51 years and 9 days after the Z340 was received by the Chronicle. The confirmation came through the San Francisco Division's official statement, brief, factual, carefully worded. It acknowledged that a team of private researchers had submitted a credible solution and that the Bureau's cryptanalysis unit had reviewed and validated their methodology. It did not name a suspect. It did not declare the case closed. It noted that the Z340's decryption did not provide investigative information identifying the perpetrator. The news cycle picked it up for approximately 48 hours. Then it moved on. A cipher that had resisted every expert on Earth for over half a century was cracked during a global pandemic, confirmed by the FBI, and the world looked at it for 2 days before turning the page. David Oranchak had spent 14 years on this problem. The decoded Z340 read, in part, as a statement of continued intent. He referenced enjoying the hunt. He commented on the police investigation, dismissively, as though watching amateurs attempt a professional's work. He used a linguistic construction that researchers had flagged in earlier letters, a specific way of describing his victims that stripped them of individuality while simultaneously centralizing himself. There was no name, no location, no confession in any legal sense. But there was a voice, the same voice that had been writing letters since 1969, now audible again after 5 decades of silence. The Z340 had spoken. It just hadn't said what anyone needed it to say. The remaining ciphers did not yield. Z13 and Z32, the 2 smallest ciphers in the Zodiac's correspondence, had been the subject of analysis for decades. Z13 arrived in April 1970, accompanied by a letter that claimed the cipher contained his identity, his name, encoded, waiting to be found. Whether that claim was true or another layer of performance, no one has been able to verify. Z13 contains only 13 symbols. That brevity is the problem. 13 characters don't provide enough statistical data for frequency analysis to function reliably. There are too many possible solutions. Any short name could be made to fit. The cipher might contain his name. It might contain a taunt. it might contain nothing meaningful at all. Without more data, the lock stays shut. The question of Arthur Lee Allen never fully closed. Even after the DNA non-match, even after his death, the circumstantial case around him remained the most assembled body of potential evidence in the investigation. People who had known Allen personally described a man who used language consistent with the Zodiac's letters, who had expressed interest in the concept of hunting humans, who seemed to take quiet satisfaction in the investigation unfolding around him. His former friend, Don Cheney, told investigators Allen had discussed a plan to kill people and call himself the Zodiac before the first murder. That conversation, if accurately reported, predated the killings. The DNA evidence said no. The circumstantial evidence said look harder. The truth sits somewhere in that gap, and it has never been retrieved. Other suspects accumulated over the decades. Lawrence Kane, a man with a history in the Lake Tahoe area and connections to surviving victim Donna Lass, who disappeared in 1970 and whose disappearance some researchers attribute to the Zodiac. Richard Gaikowski, a journalist and filmmaker with San Francisco connections whose name was proposed based on linguistic and handwriting analysis. Gary Francis Post, named by a cold case team called the Casebreakers in 2021, based on anagram analysis of the Z13 cipher and photographic comparisons. The FBI did not validate the Casebreakers' conclusion. Every suspect in this case exists in the same condition, surrounded by evidence that approaches and then retreats, circumstantial architecture that never hardens into certainty. The case does not lack for suspects. It lacks the one piece that turns a suspect into an answer. What the investigation did produce, beyond the unsolved ciphers and unidentified suspect, was a framework. The Zodiac case was one of the first in American law enforcement history to be studied through the lens of what would later be called criminal profiling. Behavioral science unit researchers at Quantico used the Zodiac's correspondence to develop early models for understanding organized killers who communicate with law enforcement. The pattern of letters, the mythology building, the staging of crime scenes, the alternation between threats and silences. All of it became data. It fed into methodologies that were later applied to other cases, serial killers caught in the 1980s and beyond, whose investigators had better tools because of work done trying to understand this one. The Zodiac never knew he was building a curriculum. The cultural footprint of the case is inseparable from its investigative history. In 1971, Clint Eastwood's Dirty Harry arrived in theaters, a film directly inspired by the Zodiac, featuring a killer who sends coded messages to newspapers and taunts police. The film defined a generation's image of what this kind of threat looked like. In 2007, David Fincher's Zodiac told the investigative story in methodical, unglamorous detail, a film more interested in what obsession does to the people trying to solve something than in the killer himself. Both films shaped public understanding of the case. But film compresses and resolves. The real case offered neither compression nor resolution. The families of the confirmed victims did not get a finale. They got decades of news cycles that reopened the wound and then moved on. By the 1990s, the active investigation had contracted significantly. Detectives who had worked the case through the 1970s had retired or died. Physical evidence had degraded. The original crime scenes had been built over, paved over, absorbed into 40 years of ordinary life. Vallejo was still Vallejo. Lake Berryessa was still there. The intersection where Paul Stine was shot was still a corner in San Francisco. But the evidence that had once been fresh was now historical. And history without a living memory attached to it loses its urgency. The San Francisco Police Department officially listed the case as open but inactive for much of this period. Open but inactive. The bureaucratic language for a wound that hasn't healed and isn't being treated. Then the internet changed everything about how cold cases breathe. Forums, databases, digitized newspaper archives, DNA genealogy platforms. The technology that brought researchers like Orenchak and Blake to the Z340 existed because of infrastructure built in the 1990s and 2000s. Infrastructure that allowed distributed investigation at a scale no police department could replicate internally. The Golden State Killer was identified in 2018 through investigative genetic genealogy, a technique that didn't exist when Joseph James DeAngelo was committing crimes in the 1970s and 80s. That same technique was applied to Zodiac DNA. The profile extracted from the letters and stamps was uploaded to genealogy databases. Produced partial matches. No definitive identification, but the search narrowed. And narrowing is progress in a case that had none for 50 years. There is something that does not get said enough about this case. 5 people were confirmed murdered. 2 more survived attacks. Donna last disappeared and was never found. The number he claimed, 37, has never been investigated to a conclusion. Every cultural artifact, every documentary, every cipher analysis, every suspect theory operates at some distance from that central fact. Real people, real families, parents who buried children, siblings who grew up with the absence where someone used to be. Mike Mageau, who survived Blue Rock Springs, gave an interview decades later. He described the night simply: the lights, the shots, the ground. He had lived his entire adult life in the aftermath of 40 minutes on a holiday evening. The ciphers are interesting. The victims are the point. Every generation inherits the Zodiac case slightly differently. For people who lived through 1969 in the Bay Area, it was personal geography. Streets they recognized, neighborhoods they had driven through, newspapers they had held in their hands. For the generation that grew up in the 1970s and 80s, it was a background radiation of civic anxiety. A case that never resolved, attached to a city they knew. For the generation that encountered it through Fincher's film or true crime podcasts, it arrived already mythologized. A puzzle wrapped in atmosphere. Each layer of inheritance adds distance from the real events and weight to the cultural ones. And that weight is something the original investigators, the men who took those calls in 1969 and drove those roads at night, could not have predicted. They thought they were working a case. They were building a permanent fixture of American crime history. Robert Graysmith was a political cartoonist at the San Francisco Chronicle in 1969. He was at his desk when the first Zodiac letters arrived. He watched the newsroom process them, and he never stopped thinking about the case. 4 years he investigated privately, interviewing witnesses, reviewing police files through whatever access he could obtain, mapping suspect timelines across the geography of Northern California. His 1986 book, Zodiac, was the most comprehensive account of the case assembled to that point. It named Arthur Lee Allen as the likely suspect. It was rigorously researched and, in places, editorially aggressive in its conclusions. Fincher's film dramatized Graysmith's obsession as much as the case itself, showing what happens to a person who refuses to let go of a problem that doesn't let go of them. Graysmith is still alive. The case is still open. What made the Zodiac case unlike most unsolved homicide investigations was not the duration. Cold cases sit unsolved for decades routinely. What made it different was the correspondence, the specific, ongoing, deliberate communication between the perpetrator and the public. Most killers do not write letters. Most killers do not design symbols or encrypt messages or call police dispatchers from payphones 40 minutes after a shooting to announce what they have done. The act of communication was as calculated as the violence. Both were instruments of the same goal, to occupy space in the world that couldn't be taken back. The violence created the victims. The letters created the mythology. And the mythology was what he seemed to care about most, toward the end, when the violence had already stopped but the correspondence continued. The question of whether the Zodiac is still alive is not rhetorical. If the first Lake Herman Road shooting occurred in December 1968, and the killer was somewhere between his mid-20s and early 40s at the time, the range most investigators have considered credible based on witness descriptions, he would be between his late 70s and early 90s today. That is old. But it is not impossible. Men in their 80s exist. Some of them killed people in 1969 and were never caught. That is a statistical fact, not a dramatic construction. The possibility that the person who stood on Lake Herman Road and shot 2 teenagers and then walked away is somewhere alive right now, in a house, in a room, with a television and a daily routine and a name no one has connected to these crimes. That possibility has not been closed. It is simply very small and very old. Investigative genetic genealogy made its most public impact on the Golden State Killer case. In April 2018, Joseph James D'Angelo, then 72 years old and living in a suburb of Sacramento, was arrested based on DNA uploaded by a relative to a public genealogy database. The technique worked by building a family tree outward from a DNA partial match until investigators identified living relatives, then worked backward to isolate individuals who fit the geographic and demographic profile of the suspect. The Zodiac's DNA, the profile extracted from the letter stamps and envelopes, has been run through the same process. Results have been reported as partial and inconclusive. The Zodiac's family tree, if it exists in any public genealogy database, either hasn't been uploaded or hasn't been identified. The technique that caught D'Angelo has not yet caught this case. But the database grows every year. In 2021, a cold case group called the Casebreakers made a public announcement. They claimed to have identified the Zodiac as Gary Francis Post, a former Air Force serviceman and house painter who died in 2018. Their evidence included anagram analysis of the Z13 cipher, claiming Post's full name was encoded in the 13 symbols, as well as photographic comparisons between Post and composite sketches, and testimony from individuals who had known him. The FBI reviewed their submission. The Bureau's response was brief. The Casebreakers' evidence did not change the investigative status of the case. The San Francisco Police Department issued a similar statement. Neither agency confirmed Post as a suspect. The Casebreakers stood by their conclusion. The case remained open. Another name had entered the gray zone. What the case has consistently resisted is the neat resolution that investigations are supposed to produce. Every thread has been followed. Every significant suspect has been investigated. The physical evidence has been tested with the best technology available in each era it was examined. The ciphers have been attacked by the most qualified cryptanalysts in the world. What remains is a case that is technically open, practically stalled, and culturally immortal. The architecture of the investigation exists. The answer to the investigation's central question does not. In most fields, that outcome would be considered failure. In criminal investigation, it is simply the category of cases that do not close. There are more of them than the public realizes. The Zodiac is the most visible example of a much larger set. The families of the confirmed victims have given statements over the years, intermittently, when journalists sought them out around anniversaries or breakthroughs. The recurring element in those statements is not anger. It is exhaustion. The particular exhaustion of people who were promised answers by the process of investigation and then watched the process work for decades without delivering them. Betty Lou Jensen's family, Darlene Ferrin's family, Paul Stein's family. These are not abstractions. They are people who sat through news cycles and documentary releases and suspect announcements and cipher solutions and emerged on the other side of each one still without the thing they actually needed. The case is intellectually fascinating to the people outside it. To the people inside it, the fascination has never been the point. The Z340 being solved changed something small but real. Not in the investigation, not in the suspect pool, not in the DNA profile or the open case file. It changed the public's relationship to what is still possible. For 51 years, the cipher had been evidence that some things cannot be cracked, that patience and intelligence and the right framing are sometimes not enough. Its solution reversed that. 3 people working across 2 countries with no institutional backing and no law enforcement authority cracked something the NSA couldn't crack in 1969. That is not a minor fact. It is a demonstration that the tools available to the present are capable of things the past could not do, which means Z13 is still a problem worth attacking, which means the genealogy database is still a resource worth uploading to, which means the case being open is not the same as the case being hopeless. There is a scene from David Fincher's film that people remember even if they don't remember the film. Robert Downey Jr.'s character, reporter Paul Avery, stands in a newsroom and says something to the effect of, "This is not a mystery with an answer waiting to be found. It's a mystery designed to stay a mystery." Fincher made that choice deliberately, to end his film not with resolution but with the feeling of a door that never opens. That choice was accurate, not as a creative decision, as a documentary one. The Rayall investigation produced the same feeling, the sensation of enormous effort applied to a problem that keeps its center intact. The Zodiac case does not withhold its answer to be dramatic. It withholds it because the man who had the answer lived his life without being made to give it up. That is the only reason left. The crosshair symbol he designed became one of the most recognized criminal insignia in American history. He drew it himself, a circle bisected by a vertical and horizontal line, the shape of a rifle scope's reticle. He used it as a signature. He stamped it onto everything. The symbol was not borrowed from anywhere. It was not a gang marking or a military emblem or a cultural reference. He created it for this purpose in the same way a brand is created, to be recognizable, to be reproducible, to be distinct. He was, among other things, a man who understood visual communication. The symbol is still reproduced today on documentary thumbnails, true crime merchandise, film posters, news graphics. Every reproduction is a continuation of the exact function he designed it for. He wanted it to be seen. It is. Retired Detective George Bewart spent years on the Arthur Lee Allen investigation in Vallejo. In interviews given after Allen's death, Bewart stated his personal conviction that Allen was the Zodiac. He acknowledged the DNA non-match. He argued, as some researchers have, that the DNA recovered from the letters may not have belonged to the Zodiac, that a third party could have licked the stamps, or that the sample had been contaminated. Whether that argument holds is a question forensic scientists have debated. What it reflects is the experience of an investigator who worked the case closely enough to believe he knew the answer and could not prove it in court. That space between professional conviction and legal proof is where this case has lived for over 50 years. And it is a space that destroys people who spend too long inside it. Mike Mageau was shot twice at Blue Rock Springs on July 4, 1969. He survived. He spent the following decades living a life that was not fully his own, shaped by that night in ways that varied in intensity but never disappeared. In 2009, 40 years after the attack, Mageau went back to the Vallejo Police Department. He had information he had never fully provided before. He identified Arthur Lee Allen from a photo lineup. 30 years after Allen had first been investigated. 7 years after Allen had died. The identification arrived too late to be acted upon. Mageau's account of what he remembered, and the decades it took him to say it out loud, is its own separate story, a story about what surviving something does to a person's ability to testify to it. Trauma is not a clean witness. The letters stopped in 1974. Then, in 1978, 4 years into the silence, one more arrived. It was sent to the San Francisco Chronicle. It was brief. Said, "I am back." Threatened a new killing. No killing followed. Investigators who analyzed the letter had divided opinions on its authenticity. Some believed it was genuine, the same handwriting, the same voice, consistent with previous correspondence. Others believed it was a copycat, produced by someone who had studied the earlier letters closely enough to approximate them. The letter has never been definitively authenticated or dismissed. It sits in the file alongside everything else, possibly the Zodiac, possibly not, adding one more layer of ambiguity to a case that had already accumulated more than it could process. Even his silences weren't clean. The ongoing research community around this case is unlike anything attached to most unsolved crimes. Thousands of individuals across multiple countries, across multiple decades, have contributed analysis, tools, databases, and investigation hours. The community has cracked one of the 4 ciphers. It has narrowed the geographic and demographic profile of the suspect. It has built digitized archives that preserved evidence that would otherwise have degraded into illegibility. This is not the same as solving the case, but it is not nothing. It is what happens when a problem persists long enough to become a shared project, when the original institutions lose momentum and something distributed takes their place. The Zodiac case is, in part, a document of what communities do with unresolved weight. They carry it, and sometimes, carrying it long enough, they move it. The Z13 cipher still sits unsolved. 13 symbols, possibly a name, possibly a final taunt, possibly both. The team that cracked Z340, Oranchak, Van Eyck, Blake, have been clear that the brevity of Z13 makes it resistant to the same computational approach. There is simply not enough data for frequency analysis to function. Any solution to Z13 would require a contextual key, something outside the cipher itself that provides a frame for reading it. That key might be embedded in the other unsolved cipher, Z32. It might be findable in the pattern of earlier letters. It might be waiting in a piece of physical evidence that hasn't been re-examined with current technology. Or it might be gone, lost with the man who wrote it, buried in the arithmetic of a life that ended without being held accountable. What does it mean for a case to remain open? In a procedural sense, it means a file exists somewhere with that designation. It means an investigator is nominally assigned. It means new evidence, if it arrived, would be received and processed. In a human sense, it means the question is still being asked. The man who walked out of the dark on Lake Herman Road in December 1968 and shot 2 teenagers and walked back into it, that man has never been named in a court, never answered for what he did, never had his life intersected by the formal process of justice. He took from those families something that cannot be returned, and he kept his name, and he lived or he died without the accounting that the system is supposed to provide. The case being open is, for the people closest to it, not a status update. It is the continuing shape of an injustice. He wanted to be remembered. He said so, not in those words, but in the consistent, methodical behavior of a man who sent letters when he could have gone silent, designed symbols when he could have left nothing, named himself when he could have remained nameless. Every act of communication was a bid for permanence, and he got it, more completely than most people who have ever lived. His symbol is on documentary thumbnails and film posters and true crime merchandise. His ciphers are studied in universities. His letters are in museums. His name, the one he gave himself, not the one he was born with, is recognized by millions of people who were not alive when he was active. The cruelest possible outcome of this case. The man who killed 5 people and terrorized a city and sent encrypted letters mocking the people trying to stop him. He got exactly what he wanted. We just never learned who he was. And somewhere in that silence, in the gap between what he took and what he was ever made to give back, 5 people remain who were never given the ending they deserved. The road is still empty. The case is still open. The question hasn't changed. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. It takes 2 seconds and it means this channel keeps going. Like this video. Leave a comment. Tell me what part hit hardest or what you think Z13 actually contains. Share it with someone who needs a story that doesn't let go. We'll be back with another one.